Hello everyone, my name is Mary. I'm a 9-time #1 arena player, and this is a video called How to Improve at Hearthstone Arena Numerically. So we're going to cover 3 topics in this video. First is the relationship between your win rate and your average. Second, we're going to talk about why win rate gets harder to improve the higher you climb. And then third, how to improve your win rate regardless. Okay, so jumping right in, let's look at this graph here. What this graph is showing on the x-axis is your win rate, which is the percentage of games you win from 0 to 100. And on the y-axis, it's your average. This is the average number of wins you get per run, from 0 to 12, of course. You'll notice a few things about this graph. First of all, it goes up and to the right, which means as your win rate goes up, your average goes up, as expected. But what I really want you to pay attention to is the curvature of the graph. You'll notice it has this really interesting shape where from like 0 until around 78%, it like kind of curves upwards, right? And then after that, it kind of like curves downwards. So what does this actually mean? I'm going to put some example values to help understand what this means. So here are the different averages you could have from 0 to 12, and then the win rate you need to have that average, right? So in order to get a 0 average, you need to win 0% of your games. In order to get a 3 average, you need to win roughly 50% of your games. If you want to know why this isn't exactly 50%, I will talk about it at the end. In order to get a 12 average, of course, you need to win 100% of your games. So let's put these on the graph to understand why the shape of the graph is interesting. So here's a 0 average, 1 average, 2 average, etc. So what I want you to notice here is that the gap from a 0 average player to a 1 average player is pretty big, right? They have a pretty big difference in win rate. The 0 average player has a 0% win rate, and the 1 average player has a 25% win rate. The gap from a 1 average player to a 2 average player is a little smaller, right? The 1 average player has a 25% win rate, the 2 average player has a 40% win rate. That's a gap of only 15 percentage points rather than 25. And you'll notice that it gets smaller and smaller and smaller until basically a 9 average. The difference in win rate between each successive average gets smaller and smaller. I put these values over here on the right side of the chart just so you can really see how small it gets. So again, a 25 percentage point jump in your win rate to get from a 0 average to a 1 average, a 15 percentage point jump to get from a 1 average to a 2 average, smaller and smaller, up until when you're an 8 average player, you have a win rate of 76.2%. A 9 average player has a win rate of 80%. That's really, really close. There's only a 3.8 percentage point difference in win rate between an 8 and a 9 average player. So looking at that information, I think you could have a naive kind of takeaway from it, which is that it seems like it gets easier to climb as you get higher, right? The graph showed us that it takes smaller and smaller win rate increases to climb. So to go from a 0 to 1, you need to increase your win rate by 25 percentage points. But from 6 to 7, you only need to increase your win rate by 4.2 percentage points, right? Does that mean it gets easier to go from 6 to 7 average than it is to go from 0 to 1 average? I think like most of us would, like our gut instinct tells us that that is definitely not correct, right? It feels way harder the higher you get. Like 1 to 2 feels harder than 0 to 1, 2 to 3 feels harder than 1 to 2. So the question kind of becomes here, why does it feel harder then to climb the higher you go when you need to increase your win rate by less and less, right? Why does 6 to 7 feel harder than 0 to 1 even though you only need to increase your win rate by such a small amount? And I think the answer to this is basically at the core of this entire video, which is that it's easy to identify big leaks in your gameplay and much harder to identify small ones. It's easier to notice when you're doing something extremely wrong that's costing you, up to 25 percentage points, maybe like a 5% leak here, 10% here, 15% here. It's easier to notice those than to notice when you're leaking 1 percentage point of win equity here or 2% here, right? It's actually easier to identify when something is like very wrong and harder to identify when something is like not so wrong. An example of a big leak could be something like you like to draft Prince Malchiazar in your decks. And an example of a smaller leak could be something like you like to keep River Crocolisk in your opening hand when you should be mulliganing it away. So I think the main point of this video, taking all of that together, is that climbing is basically a process of fixing smaller and smaller leaks in your gameplay, not only because the small leaks are all that's left to fix, but because as you climb, the small leaks will impact your average more and more, right? Just to really hammer this home, another example, if you're a 2 average player, say, and you fix like a 5 percentage point drafting leak, right? Say you're drafting too many 2-drops, And fixing that takes your win rate from 40% to 45%. You'll go to a 2.4 average, right? From 2 average to 2.4 average. It's like a relatively small impact. Now say you're a 7 average player and you fix the exact same leak, right? You are also drafting too many 2-drops. You take your win rate from 72.3% to 77.3%. You'll go from a 7 average to an 8.3 average, right? It's a massive impact on your average just because you started at a different place. And again, this holds true until around an 8.6 average, which at least on NA, like, I don't think anybody has a long-term average over 8.6. You'll often see people or hear people at like a 3 or 4 or 5 average, right? And they'll say something like, hey, I don't think I'm doing anything major wrong. There are just like small nitpicks wrong with my gameplay, but why can't I get to like a 6 average or 7 average? And that's the thing. They're absolutely right. They aren't doing anything major wrong if they've gotten to like a 3 or 4 or 5 average. But what they're missing from that statement is that it is literally those little nitpicks that are the difference between a 3 average and a 7 average, just due to the nature of how the arena format rewards win rate, like we've been looking at this video. Like losing 1 percentage point of win equity here, or 5 percentage points here, 7 percentage points here, that is literally the difference between being a 3 average player and a 7 average player. I wanted to make this slide just to really have a visual to demonstrate just how small the differences are that we're talking about, right? So we talked about a 6 average player who has a 68.1% win rate, as we saw earlier. A 7 average player has a 72.3% win rate. There's like a 4.2 percentage point differential between them. What does that actually mean in terms of the games they're playing? Well, it turns out this means that out of every 24 games that they play, the 6 average player and the 7 average player are going to get the exact same outcome, win or loss, in 23 of them, which is crazy. I promise there is one that's different here if you want to find it. But that's like a crazy small difference. That's how small of a difference we're talking about. The difference between 6 average and 7 average is that in 1 out of every 24 games, the 7 average player is going to win 1 game that the 6 average player lost. So we've talked a lot now about how it's these like tiny leaks, these single-digit percentage point leaks that are the difference between, you know, a 3 average player and a 7 average player. So now we have to ask the question, how hard is it to spot these leaks, right? So for example, how hard is it to spot a 4.2 percentage point leak? Just a reminder, 4.2 percentage point is the difference between being a 6 average player and a 7 average player. So how hard is it to spot one of these leaks? How do you do it so that you can fix it? So let's say, in our example, that right now you believe that keeping River Crocolisk in your opening hand is good, so you are always keeping River Crocolisk. One day you tune into a streamer, and they tell you that keeping it is bad, but you're not sure you believe them, right? So you want to figure out whether they're right, which strategy is better. So right now, you are currently doing what we'll call strategy A, which is always keep the River Croc in mulligan, and that is giving you a win rate of 68.1%, right? Strategy B, which is what the streamer is proposing to you, is to always toss the River Croc in mulligan. And let's say, hypothetically, unknown to you, this would give you 72.3% win rate if you did it. So what this means is right now, you have a 4.2 percentage point leak in your gameplay, okay? So how are you going to figure out whether the streamer is right, if their strategy is better, or if your strategy is better? So there's a naive idea here, which is to try keeping River Croc once, like play 1 game and keep it, and try tossing it once, play another game and toss it, and whichever one wins, we will say is the better strategy, and then we'll just do that one for the rest of time, right? Okay, so first of all, this likely results in a tie, which is terrible. Like, likely you're either going to win both when you keep it and when you toss it, or you're going to lose when you keep it and lose when you toss it, which means you're going to get an inconclusive result. Second of all, this is also likely to, even if you don't get a tie, it's likely to give you the wrong answer, where you win when you keep it. You're going to falsely conclude that a worse strategy is better just because you only did 1 trial of each. So how do we improve this? Well, let's make it slightly less naive, and let's try keeping it 10 times and tossing it 10 times, so 20 games, and whichever one wins more games is the better strategy. So you might think that this is going to do a lot better, and I will tell you right now, it actually does not. So it turns out this is going to give you the right result, as in it's going to tell you correctly that tossing it is the better strategy 48% of the time. It's actually going to tell you the wrong result 33% of the time. It's going to tell you that keeping it is better 33% of the time, and an inconclusive result, as in it'll give you the same number of wins 19% of the time. So the majority of the time, even like doing this experiment 20 times basically, you're going to get either the wrong or an inconclusive result. Okay, let's do it even better. Let's try it 50 times each, 100 games. That's gotta be pretty accurate, right? you're going to get a correct answer 64% of the time. That's a lot better, right? The wrong answer still 28% of the time, and inconclusive 8%. So still 36% of the time, you're either getting a wrong or inconclusive answer, and this is just testing this one strategy over 100 games, right? Even, it turns out, if you do 500 trials each, which means 1,000 games, you're still going to get a wrong or inconclusive answer 8% of the time, which to me is just like unacceptably high, given you're playing 1,000 games just to test out this one strategy to figure out which one is better, and you're still getting the wrong or inconclusive answers so often. The point of this is just to say that a 4.2 percentage point leak is just way too small to reliably detect for one person, like using this kind of like trial and error method. And to be honest, a 4.2 percentage point leak is pretty big. A lot of the leaks you'll end up identifying on your climb from 0 to 7 are going to be like 1 percentage point leaks, 2 percentage point leaks. 4.2 percentage points is actually pretty big, and it turns out it's still too small to really be identifiable for one person. So far in this video, we've talked through two things, and they don't paint a great picture, right? First, we said that as your average gets higher and higher, your win rate is increasingly determined by smaller and smaller leaks. And then second, we said that sufficiently small leaks are extremely difficult to detect, right? So now the question is, like, how are you even supposed to climb? And that is what the next section of this video will cover, is some practical advice for climbing and overcoming those challenges. My first piece of practical advice is that you need to be learning from other players. So we looked at that River Croc example, right? And the takeaway from that is basically that the margins get so thin that it's impossible to be able to figure out every correct play on your own, right? A season lasts like a month or 2 months, which means you have enough time to get like 500 games in, maybe, if you're playing like every day. And what we saw with the River Croc example is even if you do like 500 games, it's just not enough data to be able to reliably figure out every single thing that's optimal in the game right now on your own. I think like a decade ago, you had like 1 or 2 decisions every turn, and also Arena didn't rotate very often. Arena stayed the same for like 6-month periods. The difference now is that not only do you have like dozens of decisions every turn, but also the game changes every month or every 2 months, which means that like what is optimal or not, like some rotations keeping River Croc is good, and then some rotations keeping River Croc is bad. And to have to figure out all like thousands and thousands of those decisions in just 500 games is simply not possible. You just like can't be a lone wolf anymore. So how do you learn from other players? There's basically 2 ways. First is explicitly, right? And that's like to do co-ops, for example. So a co-op, instead of just having your own, say, 500 games of experience, you also get to learn from you and a partner's 500 games, so 1,000 games of experience coming together is better than just your own. You could watch streamers. This is like my go-to piece of advice when somebody's asking how to improve at the game, because not only do you have your 500 games of experience and now a streamer's 500 games of experience, but you also have their like chats combined like thousands and thousands of games, right, that they have learned from, synthesized into like something actionable, and are able to, hopefully, if they're a good streamer, convey that onto you. The second way, which I don't see framed this way as often, is you can implicitly learn from other players via statistics, right? These are like HS Replay, Hearthstone statistics, deck win rate statistics, draft, mulligan, whatever, all these different statistics that you can use. Essentially, like, what these platforms are giant pools of players that you can learn from. The same way in a co-op you're learning from one player, a streamer you're learning from like multiple players. Like, statistics are basically a giant pool of players who have donated their experience for you to learn from, right? So instead of just learning from your 500 games of experience, you're learning from the like tens of thousands of HS Replay players who have donated like dozens of games, hundreds of games of their own, so that you can learn from that as well. But yeah, I mean, the TLDR, like, I think at this point in Hearthstone's lifespan, given how tight the game is, how good the player base is, and how often it changes, I just think it's not reasonable to be going at it solo anymore. You need to be learning from other players. What form that takes is up to you. My second piece of advice is that if you really want to push yourself and improve, you need to do more than just play Arena. We've been talking about leaks, like the River Croc leak, as if the best way to identify leaks is always trial and error. But of course that's not true. There are actually a lot of leaks, even small ones, that can be identified directly with analysis, or at least the trial and error process can be sped up significantly with analysis. So imagine you currently have a 5 percentage point leak where you always go for lethal against your like low health opponents with Ruined Orb instead of Fiddlefire. And let's say in the current meta, like Actually, Fiddlefire is like 5 percentage points better. You know, it gives you like a 60% chance for lethal instead of a 55% chance lethal with Ruined Orb. Instead of like doing trial and error where you like cast Ruined Orb 100 times and Fiddlefire 100 times and try to figure out which one is better, or even worse, you just never do this at all and you just cast Ruined Orb every single time when it's worse, you can actually just calculate this with enough work. You can go in, look at the card pools that are available. I mean, the Fire card pool is pretty small usually. The Discover card pool is a little larger, but not that hard to get a good estimate. And you'll get a really good approximation for which card is just better, and you've just calculated it, and you don't have to do the trial and error. All it takes is a little bit of willingness to do like the outside work there. One important note here is that you should be doing analysis regardless of the outcome. For example, you should do analysis just as readily on games that you win as you do on games that you lose, runs that you get 12 wins as you do runs that you get 0 wins. You know, it's just as bad to take a 60% line and win when there's a 70% line available as it is to take a 60% line and lose when there's a 70% line available. The only difference is that the majority of players, if they're doing analysis at all, are not ever going to look into the game where they win and are only ever going to look into the game where they lose. And the funny part about this is that if you're an above 3 average player, you're winning the majority of your games, which means if you're only analyzing games where you lose, you're actually missing out on at least half of the data because you're winning the majority of the time. So you're learning at half the speed that you could be if you were willing to analyze games independent of the results. This last piece of practical advice is more about the mental game, which is that I think you should basically eliminate the term good enough from your vocabulary. Let's say you're in a game and it's really hard fought and you're playing great and you take your win equity from 0% to like 60%, you know, you make great reads, you're finding really tight lines. That's great, right? You should be proud of yourself for really increasing your win rate in that scenario. But let's say there was like a slightly better line you could have taken also that would have improved it even further from like 60% to 70%, right? I think you should still be quite proud of yourself, but also you need to be critical too of the fact that you're missing out on 10 percentage points worth of win rate. If you're taking anything away from this video, it's that tiny changes in win rate end up translating to really big changes in average. So instead of like, you know, I could have taken a 10 percentage point better line here, really what you're saying is I could have been like a 6 average player instead of a 4 average player, or an 8.5 average player instead of a 6 average player, or whatever it corresponds to based on where you are. In general, Arena is really a game played at the margins, not only in terms of win rate, like we were just talking about, but even within a game, for example, every single like tiny marginal decision ends up yielding big differences in win rate. The original title for this video was actually Arena is a game of inches, because it's really how I feel about it, is that Arena is a game of decisions that feel tiny and metrics that feel tiny, but that end up having a really outsized impact on the results. And I think at the end of the day, how good of an Arena player you are is basically proportional to how willing you are to fight over every single minor decision, every point of win rate, basically every single last inch in the game. We're actually reaching the end of the main portion of this video now, so I just wanted to summarize everything we've looked at so far. So first, we looked at how climbing is a process of fixing smaller and smaller leaks, right? The gap between each average, you know, 0 to 1, 1 to 2, 2 to 3, gets smaller and smaller in terms of win rate. So in order to hit every next average, you're trying to identify leaks that are impacting your win rate by less and less. Number 2, we said that as the leaks get sufficiently small, they become very hard to identify and therefore to fix. And then third, we said that the best players are basically the people who can still identify those leaks by doing 3 things. Number 1, using information from others, right? Either via co-ops or watching streamers or by using statistics. 2, doing constant analysis, regardless of the outcomes of games, you know, always analyzing, did I make the best play here? And 3, related to number 2, is like never getting complacent, always being willing to fight over every single last percentage point of win rate, because every single last percentage point of win rate translates to a really big difference in your average. So that is actually going to do it for the main portion of this video. If you stuck around till now, I really appreciate it. I hope you enjoyed. Feel free to leave me a comment with any feedback. If you want to see more of these videos, let me know. I would be potentially interested in making them. Follow me, of course, here on YouTube and on Twitch at Mermides on both places. And then, yeah, the video isn't over yet. I'm going to be doing what I'm calling footnotes, basically covering some miscellaneous topics and getting a little deeper into some of the math stuff. Basically anything I wanted to talk about during the video, but I didn't really think I had time to do. So yeah, feel free to stick around. It's interesting stuff, but definitely not as practical as the earlier stuff. This first footnote is going to be talking about the model I used for win rate and average. We saw the graph earlier, and we've been saying things like, oh, to get a 7 average, you need to have a 72.3% win rate. And you might be wondering where those numbers come from. That is what this slide is talking about. We are using the simplest possible model, which is if you have a win rate of, say, 50%, assume you go into every single game with a 50% probability of winning that game, right? At your 0-0 game, 50%. 0-1, 50%, 11-2, 50%. Of course, your runs end at either 12 wins or 3 losses, so given that win rate, in order to calculate your average, you just want to find the expected number of wins you get in a run. I'm not going to go in depth here, but this term is basically looking at all the ways you can get between 0 wins and 11 wins in a run, which ends in that number of wins and 3 losses. And then this term is looking at all the ways you can get 12 wins in a run, which means you have between 0 and 2 losses and 12 wins. This model isn't perfect though, right? I don't think a player with a 50% win rate is winning 50% of their games at every single, possible position. For example, I think you're probably more likely to win a game at 0-2 than 11-0 in general. So that's within a run. I think there's differences in your win probability. And then also, I think across runs there can be differences. So for example, after a 0-win run, I think it's likely a lot of us would get tilted, and then our chance to win the next 10 games, 20 games would probably go down. But in general, this model should pretty closely resemble reality. And on the next slide, we're going to look at an example of how win rates still are forced to be within a certain range. It's a pretty tight range, even regardless of the extreme cases. Okay, the second footnote is talking about something we mentioned way back at the beginning of the video, which is why does a 50.1% rather than a 50% win rate correspond to a 3 average under this model? I think a lot of us think the 50% win rate is the number because if your runs go 3-3, you're winning 3 games and you're losing 3 games. Isn't that exactly a 50% win rate? Which is correct. The problem is you sometimes get 12 win runs, even as a around 50% win rate player. If a run ends at 12 wins, it doesn't accrue the 3 losses. So you can kind of think this gets your win rate and average out of sync. It's increasing your win rate by a lot, but not increasing your average proportionately as much. Just as a simple example, if every time you queued into Arena, you went 0-3, 0-3, 0-3, and then 12-0, and then just over and over and over again every 4 runs, your average would be a 3, exactly right, because you're getting 12 wins every 4 runs, but your win rate would be 12 wins out of 21 games, which is a 57.1% win rate, so you could be a 3 average player with as high as a 57.1% win rate. But under the model we talked about last slide, which is assuming that all of your games are independent and you go into each one with a 50.1 probability to win, that is what will give you the 3 average. A 50% win rate under this model would give you 2.99, I think, or 2.98 average. And yeah, just as a note, this is true not only of 3 wins, but of all of the averages. You could theoretically, for example, be a 12 average player with an 85.7 win rate if all of your runs went exactly 12-2, right? 12 over 14 is 85.7%. Again, in reality, it's just not going to happen like that, but it could definitely be possible in some extreme world. And I will note that this is only true, again, because of the cap of 12 wins. If runs didn't stop at 12 wins, say they only stopped at 3 losses, you could go 15-3 or 23 or 103. Your win rates and averages would correspond exactly 1-to-1. A 3 average would be exactly 50%. There wouldn't be this range of possible win rates for any given average, or a range of possible averages for any given win rate. It would be exactly 1-to-1. Okay, this footnote we're talking about the shape of the average/win rate graph. Just as a quick reminder, we talked about at the very beginning how the graph kind of curves upwards until this point. This point is exactly 78.6% win rate, and then kind of curves downwards after that point. And just a reminder, what that actually means is that the gap between each average, 0-1, then 1-2, etc., is getting smaller and smaller until a 9 average, and then after a 9 average, it gets bigger and bigger. So intuitively, why does that start to happen? And the answer is basically that before that point, before 78.6% win rate, every point of win rate is helping you do 2 things. It's helping you reduce your losses, which means your runs don't end, and then it also increases the number of wins you get given that your run doesn't end. Why does that stop? The only reason that stops is because after a certain point, most of your runs are going to be getting 12 wins, so the cap starts to kick in and reduce that. If your runs are going 12 wins, that means every point of win rate is only helping you do one thing. It's only helping you reduce losses. It's not actually helping you increase wins very much anymore because most of your runs are getting 12 wins anyways. So all you're doing is reducing the chances that you lose the run early. Just as a maybe more obvious example, at 97% win rate versus 100% win rate, I think it's pretty easy to see why this and this would have basically the same average. It's like 11.98 versus 12. Because at 100% win rate, your runs will go 12-0, 12-0, 12-0. At 97% win rate, your runs will probably go like 12-0, 12-0, 12-1, 12-2, maybe an occasional 11-3. But in general, they're going to have like basically the same average, even though their win rate is 3 percentage points different. The math answer for this is that number of wins before a certain number of failures is a negative binomial distribution. In this case, it is capped, again, at 12 wins, but before that kicks in, the expected number of successes is 3p divided by 1 minus p. This is basically a formal expression of this first bullet point, which is that every point of win rate helps you in two ways: increasing the number of wins you get here in the numerator, and then also decreasing the amount of losses you get here in the denominator. And this has a hyperbolic growth pattern with respect to p. That's why you get the curve upwards first. And then the inflection point happens when the second derivative is equal to 0. You can find that with calculus, use AI, which is what I did. And that's where the concavity changes, again, due to the 12-win cap, because once the 12-win cap starts to kick in, you're no longer really getting an increased amount of wins, because your runs are stopping at 12 anyways. You're just reducing the chances that you lose the run early. Just a small fun fact here. We've talked about how detecting small leaks is hard, but it turns out there is a condition where it's easier, which is if your win rate is very near or is actually 0%, or very near or is actually 100%. So just as a quick example, say you have a leak right now where you frequently mill cards, and no matter what win rate you start at, this costs you 5 percentage points of win rate. So if your win rate is 50%, and if you fix this, as in you stopped milling cards, you would go to 55%. You'll notice that this leak is trivial to detect if your baseline win rate is 0%, as in you're winning none of your games, and then as soon as you stop milling cards, you go to 5% win rate. This is trivial to notice that you had a leak and have now fixed it because you were winning no games before. As soon as you win one game by stopping milling cards, you're going to notice, oh, okay, that's better. That's a really important thing to do. Also, on the same side, by symmetry, if your baseline win rate is 95%, and when you fix it, it goes to 100%, you stop milling cards and suddenly you're winning every single one of your games, you'll also know pretty quickly that you have a leak because you'll lose 0 games when you're doing this strategy, and you'll actually lose some games when you're doing the original strategy. You can kind of see intuitively that this is true not just at exactly 0 and exactly 100, but also, for example, at 1% versus 6%, or 94% versus 99%. You'll notice that it's easier to detect these leaks when you're closer to the edges. So the takeaway here is not something super actionable, but as your win rate climbs, it'll get a little bit easier to detect leaks if you're above 50%, because you're getting closer to 100%. And if you're an abysmally bad player, you're near 0% win rate, in theory, it'll make it easier to detect leaks as well. But if you were able to do that, you probably wouldn't be a 0% win rate player in the first place. The math justification for this quickly is you say let P sub A and P sub B be the success probabilities of strat A and B, like the strat where you draw a lot of cards and don't care if you mill, and the strat where you start to care about milling cards. And you say let X sub A and X sub B be the number of games you're winning under each of those strategies, and these will be random variables distributed as binomial with n P sub A and P sub B. The decision criteria you're using for which strategy is better is you basically subtract the counts from each other, and if X sub A minus X sub B is greater than 0, you say X sub A is the better strategy, and if this is less than 0, you say X sub B is the better strategy, and if it's equal to 0, it's inconclusive. This is the same thing we did with River Croc. And yeah, basically the thing to notice here is that the variance of X sub A minus X sub B is what you want to minimize, because if the variance is high, that's when you're going to get the wrong result, no matter what it is. In this case, it would be getting an answer that's above 0 when it should be below 0. These are independent random variables, so you can just add the variances together. There's no covariance. And then basically you'll notice that the variance is maximized when P sub A plus P sub B divided by 2 is equal to 0.5, which is to say when the midpoint between P sub A and P sub B is 50%. The hardest to notice in this example would be if your win rate while milling cards was 47.5% and your win rate without milling cards was 52.5%, because the center is exactly 50%. And the variance is also a downward facing parabola if you graph it out, which means that as you get closer to 0% and 100%, the variance goes down, which is why, like we said, it's easier to detect the leaks near the edges, 0% and 100%. This last slide, I wanted to talk about what we can generalize from this video. What from this video is applicable outside of just Hearthstone Arena? And I think the answer is basically all of it. So first, talking about like skill curves, right? This was our win rate against average curve. Of course, it depends on how you're measuring skill and success in other games. But for example, any game with a geometric or negative binomial distribution of successes should probably get increasing returns on skill. For example, a game like baseball, a very simplified model of baseball is how many home runs can you get before you get 3 outs. That's a model for like a single inning of baseball, which, you know, is very similar to Hearthstone, right? Which is how many wins can you get before you get 3 losses. Any game like that would probably get increasing returns with respect to skill, you know, your batting average or whatever being maybe a measure of skill. Any capped game, for example, like bowling has a maximum score of 300, probably gets decreasing returns near the cap. I mean, depending on what your measure of skill is, like maybe your strike percentage or something. I haven't modeled either of these two out. They were just the first 2 examples that stuck out to me as being similar to those 2 different parts of Arena's model. And more generally, I think it's just helpful to understand skill curves, right? Helpful to understand, like we went through in depth in this video, like how small and large are the gaps between like each like skill quote unquote level. How much do you need to improve to get from here to here? So once you can understand like quantifiably how much you need to improve, it actually makes the task a lot more manageable, I think. The second thing that I think is generalizable is that small leaks are hard to detect in all games. For example, this is why I believe like poker solvers and chess engines have become like really critical parts of the modern workflow for the top players in those fields. I mean, the TLDR, as I understand it, is that humans just don't have the ability to detect like 0.1 percentage point leaks, 0.01 percentage point leaks, and engines can't do that because they have infinite sample size and infinite compute. Yeah, just like Hearthstone, I think it's not enough to be a lone wolf anymore. Like there's no way any chess player could just go in and play a bunch of chess and become the best player in the world anymore. It's just not a realistic part of the modern world, and I think Hearthstone over the last 10 years has been like a pretty prime example of that, just on a really accelerated timeline, right? I think at the beginning of Hearthstone, for the first couple of years, you could have been a lone wolf and figured it all out on your own, and now I think it's effectively impossible. Oh, also over here, I graphed out a skill curve just for fun of your game win rate against the odds you win a best of 5 constructed Hearthstone tournament on the y-axis, and you can see it has an S-curve. It's for a slightly different reason than Arenas, and I don't want to get into it now. But yeah, I mean, you can see that there are other things in the world that are probably pretty similar in terms of their skill curves. Alright, this is the real end of the video now. If you made it here past all the footnotes and everything, I really appreciate you sticking through the whole thing. I hope you enjoyed it. I learned a lot and had a lot of fun making this video, so my hope is that you learned something and had some fun as well. If you did, feel free to give me a follow here on YouTube and on Twitch at Myrmides. I stream Hearthstone Arena and some other games, and yeah, hopefully I'll see you there. Thank you for watching. Bye-bye.